Go.
Good evening, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. I hope everyone is staying safe, wearing masks, and reading many biographies. My name is Kai Bird, and I am the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Tonight we are here to celebrate William Faulkner, or rather to celebrate his latest biographer, the great Carl Rollyson. Faulkner has fascinated and mystified readers of 20th century literature for decades. I confess I have been reading him in the last year for the very first time, if only because I am writing a biography of Jimmy Carter, and Faulkner was Carter's favorite novelist. I recently learned that Carter subjected his sons to, quote, Faulkner sessions, whereby the future president would read aloud from this very Southern novelist. Faulkner's readers have long been curious about the man behind the novels, but despite numerous biographies, Faulkner's private life has remained rather elusive. Now, in this season of the pandemic, Carl Rollyson has written a sweeping new biography that encompasses 2 full volumes. Volume 1 was published last spring, and Volume 2 was officially published just 2 days ago. Carl will be in conversation with Anne Heller to discuss both volumes of The Life of William Faulkner. Carl Rollyson is a professor emeritus at Baruch College, and he has published numerous biographies of such literary figures as Sylvia Plath, Susan Sontag, Lillian Hellman, Amy Lowell, Rebecca West, and Norman Mailer. Anne C. Heller is the author of Ayn Rand and the World She Made, and Hannah Arendt, A Life in Dark Times. She is the former managing editor of the Antioch Review, fiction editor of Esquire and Redbook, and executive editor of the magazine development group at Condé Nast Publications. She has also written for numerous magazines, including Vogue and Vanity Fair. And I hand the evening over to you virtually, and I only wish we could dine with you and Carl afterwards, but maybe in a year.
Good evening, and hello, Carl.
Hello.
And hello, everybody. Carl, you have, in record time, it seems to me, I'm sure it doesn't seem to you, produced perhaps the most comprehensive and sweeping biography of William Faulkner. You and I have discussed your love of Faulkner's work many times, but you've written many biographies before tackling Faulkner. And you've had a long history with Faulkner. Will you tell us about that history and about why you decided to write his life now?
Well, that history goes back 50 years into my early 20s when I studied with a Southern literature scholar, M. Thomas Inge, at Michigan State University. And I was immediately taken with Faulkner, particularly his sense of history. Even then, I was interested in history and even more historiography, which I ultimately came to realize led to my interest in biography and how stories are told and how individuals shape the past. I think this is what struck me in Faulkner, is his keen attention to that. And at the time I was reading philosophers of history and historians like Herbert Butterfield and R.G. Collingwood, and I could see lots of parallels, and that led to a dissertation at the University of Toronto on William Faulkner called Uses of the Past in the Novels of William Faulkner. So that just takes us into the mid-1970s. I continued to write some articles about Faulkner and his sense of the past, and then went on, as you mentioned, to write these other biographies. I can't say that I always had in mind to do a biography of William Faulkner, But around the year 2005, I reviewed Jay Perini's biography of Faulkner and began to, having done several biographies, think about the, I guess, sort of arrogant idea, well, I could do that, and in some ways, maybe I can do it in a different way, and in a way that looks at him not just as a Southern novelist, and even not just as a novelist, but as a writer of history, as someone who took that sense of himself as a writer, no matter where he went. And there were a lot of misleading stories about Faulkner, particularly his period in Hollywood, for example, which are treated sometimes as a kind of irrelevance or detour or digression. And it seemed to me we needed a biography that captured the whole man, which involved also digging much more deeply into his family relationships than I think some of the other Faulkner biographers care to do.
Absolutely. For those in the audience who don't know a lot about William Faulkner and perhaps have read one or two of his novels, before we go on, could you give us a sense of the trajectory of Faulkner's life and his accomplishments over the span of his life?
Oh, sure, yes. He was born in 1897. He was born into a Southern family. His great grandfather was a Civil War soldier, uh, headed his own company, also was a novelist, wrote a very popular novel called The White Rose of Memphis. And so Faulkner grew up with that sense of a writer in the family, even though none of the other generations of the Faulkners were particularly literary at all. But he had a marvelous mother who painted, who was very interested in literature. To give you an idea of just how wide ranging her interests were, when she died, Lady Chatterley's lover was on her bed table. So she was not the typical Southern lady by any means, although she held a lot of the typical Southern ladies' attitudes, particularly about politics and social relations and race and so on. Well, Faulkner grew up in that kind of atmosphere. He himself, later looking on it, said, I don't really understand how I came to write those novels, given the kind of environment I lived in, because he really didn't have role models other than a local lawyer, Phil Stone, who was very interested in modern literature. So that got Faulkner going. Faulkner knew that as attached as he was to his hometown of Oxford, he had to get out of there. And what really became important to him was New Orleans, which was not that far from Mississippi, from where he grew up. And that's where he met Sherwood Anderson. That's where he met other artists of various kinds, painters, musicians. He met, by the way, a lot of people from the Northeast, a lot of Harvard graduates. Harvard, in a curious way, is in a very important part of Faulkner's writing. That got him interested. Um, he had wanted to serve in World War One. We can get into that in more detail. I'll just say now that he signed up in the RAF. Now, people will tell you sometimes he was small. He was 5 feet 5, and it's sometimes been said, well, he didn't meet the physical specifications for the Army for military service in the U.S. That's just not true. They accepted men Faulkner's size all the time. Another biographer, Joseph Blattner, really worked that out, that wasn't the case at all. You know what it was about Faulkner? He was, in part, he bought that Southern aristocratic myth. And so for him, flying a plane was the equivalent of the cavalry. It was dashing. It was elegant. It was romantic. And he was going to sign up, and he did sign up, what was then called the Royal Flying Corps, became the RAF, went to Toronto, was fascinated with airplanes, wrote, did detailed drawings of planes, flight simulations, that kind of thing. And then the war ended. Oh my God. That's, in a sense, the burden of his first published novel, Soldier's Pay. It's got a character in there who's constantly bemoaning the fact that he never actually gets to fight. Well, I don't know if you want me to get into this now, Anne, but he came home from Toronto pretending to have flown a plane even worse, he pretended to other people that he had crashed a plane, that he had a metal plate in his head, he had a cane, he had wings that he had no right to on his uniform that indicated that he was he had flown planes and been in combat. He did none of those things.
And then he went on after going to New Orleans and spending a year or so there, came back and began to write a series of novels. It's extraordinary. Between 1929 and 1932, he produced some of his greatest.
Yes.
I'm looking for the list I have of those, but they included Sanctuary and The Sound and the Fury, which was his third published novel, I believe, As I Lay Dying, and wonderful short stories, including A Rose for Emily and others that we all know, and then Light in August, which is, in my opinion, one of his masterpieces.
Oh, yeah.
How did he do all of that in the course of 4 years after coming back from a war that he felt inadequate for not having fought in, actively?
Yeah, almost as important as his feeling about the war was he took a trip to Europe during part of that New Orleans time. Actually, he took a boat from New Orleans and traveled through Italy and France, went to England as well, was in Switzerland. That really triggered his imagination in a lot of ways. He got to know what fascist Europe was like in Mussolini's Italy. He came home. The other thing that happened to him is that his childhood sweetheart, Estelle Oldham, she had married another man and she went off to the Far East, and he seemed to have lost her. Eventually, that marriage does not work out. In the mid to late 1920s, Estelle comes back to Oxford, much more sophisticated, and she's been writing fiction, and she's been writing about the issue of race in places like Hawaii and China. And that was one of the untold stories, as far as I was concerned, about Faulkner. Even his taste in food changed, became more sophisticated. I think it wasn't his wife alone, of course, and it wasn't Europe alone. It was a driving ambition. He said curious things about Southern literature. He said, we really haven't produced anything great yet. And I think in a way that was part of the motivator for him, was this, suddenly he realized, and Sherwood Anderson had the role to play here, that his own, as he called it, postage stamp of native soil had these wonderful stories, generations of stories, which he would explore, as he does in The Sound and the Fury. That's a very difficult novel, I'll grant you that, but it really is historical in the sense that this is a family that generation after generation, uh, long before the Civil War, actually, not much as made of it in The Sound of the Fury, but Faulkner later wrote what he called the Compson Appendix. It's a family which has devoted itself, in a sense, to the lost cause, not just the lost cause of the Civil War, but the lost cause of the kind of aristocracy that certain Southern white families thought that they embodied. And it seems to me what he does in The Sound of the Fury, in a vicious way, sometimes in a viciously funny way, he really exposes that pretension to aristocratic nobility. And at the time, especially in the late 20s and early 30s, Southerners did not forgive him for doing that.
Were not unlike his own family, the Faulkners, in certain respects.
That's right. It's the great grandfather who's the pinnacle in a way, and you've got then another three generations. Oh, they're bankers, lawyers. His father was not particularly successful, and he doesn't. There aren't any characters really based on his father until his last novel, The Reavers. Yeah, the family had declined just as the Compsons had, and the drinking, the inability to succeed in the Compsons is a kind of displaced history of the Faulkner family, even though if you look at each of those characters, they're not much like the Faulkners. Although I have to tell you, the Faulkner's mother, when she read the Jason section, she said, "That's just like your daddy."
Really? um, the so that lost cause, that civil war, and there's a sense in all of Faulkner's novels, or most of them anyway, of uh, a golden moment which was not really golden,
Yeah.
and a heartbreak and a deterioration that um, that begins at that, whatever that image of that moment is, through the generations. In almost all of his books, there's a sense of loss and deterioration. And so I wonder what that has to do with his experience of his own heritage, which, was both so proud. He was proud of it, if I
Yes.
read your work correctly.
Yes.
But he's also its best critic, perhaps, certainly of his generation, maybe of all time.
That's right.
What do you make of his ability? Where did he find that ability to be in and to be so sharply detached from at the same time?
I think to a great extent he does get it from his mother, because his mother was not sentimental. Um, while his father was reading Zane Grey, his mother was reading Joseph Conrad. Uh, while his relatives were sitting around celebrating Civil War battles, although he admired that gallantry you see in his novels, he realized it's also kind of foolish to commit yourself to wars you can't win. There's no way you can do that. So he walked around like a Faulkner. People talked about him putting on airs. They called him Count, and because early on he made nothing from his writing, they would call him Count No Count. Uh, he on the one hand walked around with a sense of entitlement, and on the other hand, he knew how ridiculous that was. And I think a writer needs that sense of complexity, that ability to criticize himself in order to create the kinds of characters that distinguishes his fiction.
Did you ever count the number of characters in Faulkner's fictional works, not counting his screenplays?
No, no, I'm very bad at math.
I was wondering how he compares to Dickens, for example. He made
Yeah.
a lot of characters, but maybe not as many as
Well,
Dickens.
it's funny you should mention Dickens, because he read Dickens almost every year of his life. As soon as he could read, he was reading Dickens.
You can, I can sense that certainly in his Snopes stories, in his comic
Yes,
characters, you can feel Dickens poking through.
absolutely.
So there have been many biographies in the past of William Faulkner. What is it like to be the latest biographer of a great American figure about whom so much has been written? And how did you benefit from previous work? And where did you find you had to correct previous work?
Right. Well, yes, there have been many biographies of Faulkner, very good books, and I do feel like I stand on the shoulders of giants. Joseph Blattner, who wrote the original biography, which is also 2 volumes, is a real bedrock of biography. He talked to people that were certainly no longer available to me.
Was that
Uh,
published when in the
1974.
uh-huh.
Yeah, 1974. So about 10, 12 years after Faulkner died. And he was able to interview Estelle Faulkner, Faulkner's wife, and his daughter Jill. So he was really essential. At the same time, he was an authorized biographer. And Jill herself, the daughter, Jill Faulkner, said that he told a number of white lies to protect certain things about the family, which Jill eventually, much later, years later, was more candid about herself. There have been many other biographers who have, contributed. Jay Perini did, one of the latest biographies to sort of present the whole story. For me, there's one book that was key, and that was Carvel Collins's. It's a book that was never written. He never wrote a word of it, but he started researching Faulkner's life in the late 1940s. And to the day he died in 1990, was still researching. I once asked him, I knew Carvel, and I said to him, when do you think your book will appear? And I guess this was in the late 1970s. And Carvel said, well, I haven't found the figure in the carpet, to use James' term. And he never did. But what he did do is collect a lot of interviews, which are at the University of Texas in 105 boxes. And one of the reasons I decided to do the biography is because when I looked through everybody's notes in the other biographies, only Perini had looked at all at Carvel Collins's work, and even that seemed very sporadic.
Wow.
So it took forever, but I went through every one of those boxes, and it was so valuable because not only did he interview members of Faulkner's family and Faulkner's friends, but he would interview the staff of the Algonquin Hotel where Faulkner liked to stay when he came to New York. So that was just extremely important. Other biographers like Frederick Carl, really interesting psychological insights that I could draw on as well.
So you've raised two questions. I don't want to lose track of them. What did Joseph Faulkner not tell us that you learned and that we now know? And did you find the figure in the carpet?
Well, I think I found the figure in the carpet in the sense that I'm dealing with the whole man and the whole writer. And as good as the other Faulkner biographies are, they don't, and that's why I took 2 volumes. They don't look at every aspect of him as a writer. They're so, and it's not surprising, they're so enamored of him as a novelist and as a short story writer that other aspects of his life and his writing, particularly Hollywood, they don't really concentrate on. Now with Faulkner, even though his 2-volume biography must be close to 1 million words, mine is about 500,000 words. Even with all that research, for instance, he really had very little to say about Nita Carpenter, who Faulkner had a almost 15-year on and off love affair with. And in fact, in one of his letters indicates that Faulkner, didn't take her seriously. And I just thought that was a mistake. We all have to make our assessments as biographers and how do we trust our sources. So I went right at the Nita Carpenter material, not only her memoir, which is published, but I found the manuscript of the memoir, which left things out. And most importantly, I found the tape recordings that she did with her co-author, in which there were constant digressions and things to be said that just didn't make it into the book for a number of reasons. So there was all of that to explore. Also, Faulkner doesn't deal with Estella's fiction at all. And yet she was writing about race, for example, before Faulkner was. I don't see how you can write a biography and not, look at what she was doing. And Faulkner does mention this, but he makes nothing of it. Faulkner and his wife actually submitted 2 short stories at one point. They weren't accepted for publication, but that gives you somehow idea of how close the collaboration was. So I wanted to get at that, who Estella Faulkner was, and what impact she had on the marriage and on the writer.
The material you found about Meta Carpenter, is that her name? Yeah. In that's one of the biographer's delights, isn't it, to find unexpected sources of material on.
Yes.
But no,
I had the good fortune of meeting her many years ago when I was doing my Lillian Hellman biography. And although I didn't know then I would be doing a Faulkner biography, of course we talked all about Faulkner.
So let's talk a little bit about Estelle. She was a contradictory and complicated character herself.
Yes.
She frail, she was flamboyant, she was demanding, she was talented and ambitious, and she gave Faulkner quite a ride. Can you tell us what you think the effect of her literary work early on, and of her character in general, which, from my point of view, appears in many of his books in different disguises, particularly Sanctuary, which you
Yes,
read
oh yeah.
quite a good deal about in the character of Temple Drake, one of the most, I don't know, I don't know what to call Temple Drake for anyone who's in Sanctuary. She's a victim of a brutal rape who then she's the daughter of a judge, one of Faulkner's class, who is subjected to a brutal rape by a gangster. And yet she contains some of Estella's qualities. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and the daughter, being a daughter of a judge, Estelle was not the father of a judge. Well, her father actually had been a judge for a few years, but she grew up educated by another relative, Judge Niles. She was reading Conrad before Faulkner was reading Conrad. And there's this story she liked to tell about when Faulkner was just a little boy, not even 10. And he was riding down the street with his brother on ponies. They were all on ponies. And Faulkner, as the eldest, he was in the lead, leading his younger brothers. And Estelle took one look at him, this boy, and she said to her nursemaid, she said, "I'm going to marry that boy." And they did. They had this incredible rapport as children. He would write poems to her, and even after she married another man, he was writing poems to her. She was a source of inspiration for him. A source. At one point, he called her a great literary critic. He was giving her things that he was writing. Um, she embodied certain. There's a certain wariness. Some people would even call it misogyny in Faulkner's attitudes toward women that Estelle embodied and that you see in Temple Drake in Sanctuary. But look at what happens to Faulkner. And I think this was part of this long, enduring marriage, which kept seeming to fall apart. At one point, she filed divorce papers, but didn't go through with it. He stayed with her, he stayed with her, he stayed with her, and look what happens. When you get to the second volume of my biography, Temple Drake appears, and she's much older. She's thought about the consequences of her actions, of what that rape meant. She's still a risk taker. She almost runs away from her husband, Gowan Stevens, but doesn't.
So this is in Requiem for a Nun, which was a
Requiem for a Nun. Yeah.
sequel.
And a lot of the women characters in the last part of the Snopes trilogy also show tremendous growth in his understanding of women. But there were these mixed feelings. There's no doubt about it. And Estelle was, in a sense, his first inspiration, who he came back to in a number of different ways. Although, like a lot of writers, he wasn't very honest about his sources. If you had asked him, he might very well have said Estelle had very little to do with what he wrote, and yet I think it's there on the page.
Well, the question of Faulkner's attitudes toward women and sex have come up, and it strikes me that throughout his writing life, they were his approach was ambiguous, and he seemed ambivalent, to say the least. He often presents the women in his fiction as sort of primitive, primal, powerful, and the sex as basically ruinous. So is this just a matter of inhabiting a fallen world? The end of the Civil War, the loss of the Civil War, the defeated people, or is this something else? How have you come to think about that?
Faulkner called himself a Puritan in one of his letters, and he wasn't speaking so much about religiosity as he was this attitude towards sex. He had a tendency to idealize women. he had idealized Estelle. But what happens when you idealize a human being who is um, flawed? We're all flawed. And someone who's an idealist uh, will become disenchanted at some point. This, after all, is Quentin Compson's problem in The Sound and the Fury, is he idealizes his sister Caddy, and he can't stand the idea that she's having sex with these other men, and he even contemplates the idea of incest. Um, Faulkner had no sister, uh, but he had this, again, yes, complex of emotions about women and what they were capable of. But here's where biography comes in. If you're a reader of Faulkner's fiction, you're making all sorts of assumptions about him. Well, what if you read one of his screenplays, for example? It's an original screenplay, all by Faulkner. It's called Latin American Kingdom Story. It's his attempt to write in the vein of Joseph Conrad. And who's at the center of it? It's a woman, and she's leading a revolution. She's very much different from the other women that Faulkner writes about in this fiction. And one of the things that Hollywood allowed him to do, in a way, was to find these other outlets for his emotions and feelings that sometimes did not get explored in the fiction. You would think that the fiction, and it's paramount. There's no doubt about that, and yet the screenplays are a way of measuring that fiction and looking at what Faulkner chose to leave out as well.
Mhm. It's very interesting. You, I think, are the first person to integrate the a reading of all the screenplays produced, published, unpublished, co-written, written by
Yes.
Faulkner alone, into an analysis of his literary preoccupations, his evolving literary style. How do you think his work in Hollywood affected him in a literary way?
In a number of different ways. When he first got there, after
Tell us first what his screenplays were. Have we seen any of the movies that he wrote?
To Have and Have Not, for example, The Big Sleep, both of those he co-wrote with other writers. He had a hand in the genre noir movie The Southerner, and he little bits and pieces of other movies as well. Air Force, a Howard Hawks film. He wrote The Death Scene. He did a number of things that actually got on the screen. He didn't always get screen credit, but he did a number of things. Hollywood was interesting. He went there for the money. There's no doubt about it. He needed the money for all kinds of reasons. And once he got there, though, he wasn't like, say, Fitzgerald, who said, "I'm the great novelist. I have things to teach you. I can do this certainly better than those Hollywood hacks." He never did that. What he would do is, what's needed here in the scene or in the screenplay? What can I do? Hawks was going to film the story of his turnabout, which became Today We Live. And they were all set to go. The producer, Irving Thalberg, said, great, and so on. And then a couple weeks later, Hawks has to come back to Faulkner and said, well, there's a problem. And Faulkner said, what's the problem? And Hawks said, well, Joan Crawford really needs a role. We have to have her in so many pictures a year, and she's going to be in your movie. And Faulkner drew a beat, and he said, I don't recall there being a woman in my story. And Hawk said, Bill, look, you're in Hollywood. That's the way it is. So what did Faulkner do? He sat down with Joan Crawford and he wrote her role. He learned it. And if you look at one of his novels, The Wild Palms, there's a reference in there to Joan Crawford, very sly reference to Joan Crawford. She taught him some things about screenwriting. The most important thing, and this occurs in volume 2 of my biography, is during the war, during Second World War. He's working on a number of scripts, the De Gaulle story, for example, and then a film called Battle Cry, which other writers worked on, but Faulkner was the main writer. And he's got a character in there, a black character, whose name is America. And he's taken care of by this good old boy Southerner. Uh, you can see Faulkner beginning to change and having a different sense of an audience. This is before Malcolm Cowley comes along. before he wins the Nobel Prize. People think that's when Faulkner changed in some ways as a writer. No, the change is in Hollywood when he realizes he's part of this national effort and that his screenplay or the movies he's going to work on are going to be seen by millions of people. And I'll just add very quickly, Battlecry does not get to the screen. It would have been the most ambitious World War II film ever made. It was in every theater of the war. So it's quite a remarkable achievement. But what does get to the screen is To Have and Have Not. And Faulkner's great creation there is the character Eddie. Other writers have worked on it, but the Eddie you see that Walter Brennan plays, that's William Faulkner's creation. And that's what makes To Have and Have Not one of the great anti-fascist films.
Yes, that you mentioned earlier the traveling in Europe early on, and the fact that he saw the beginnings of fascism in the late 1920s, and he really paid attention. And as early as Light in August, we have a ferocious fascist character. Can you talk a little bit about Dickens and his relationship to fascist tendencies in the South and in the United States as a whole, both in his screen work and in his fiction?
Yeah, Faulkner became aware in 1925 in Mussolini's Italy of what it meant to live in a society where people could not speak their minds. In fact, in a story of his, Mistral, which is in his collected stories, the two American characters keep using the phrase no speaka, which on the one hand is just what Italians are telling them. They don't speak English. But no speaker really becomes, we can't talk about this. There's a murder that's occurred in this small Italian mountain town, and they can't talk about it. It involves a fascist soldier and a priest, and they won't level with the Americans. Well, what was it like in Faulkner South, in Oxford, Mississippi? Where there had been a lynching, the Nels Patton lynching in 1908 when Faulkner was 10, 11 years old. People did not speak about exactly what happened in those circumstances. He deals with this in his novels and a short story, Dry September. In Light in August, he creates this character, Percy Grimm, who, like Faulkner, has missed out. He hasn't served in the war. He doesn't have his military credential. And what he essentially does is what some young men are doing today. He puts together a militia. Okay, it's the origins of the way fascists work. He takes these patriotic feelings and he perverts them in Light in August. And Faulkner said, the novel was published in 1932. He had created a Nazi before he knew there were Nazis. I mean, he knew there were Nazis, but the character itself is so dead on that it's the culmination, in a way, not only of Faulkner's experience in Mussolini's Italy, but his experience in southern towns where you just couldn't speak about certain things. It wasn't said. It might happen, but exactly what happened in a lynching was hard to determine.
It would be so interesting were you to write a little essay about Percy Grimm in our current moment. Um, so, which of Faulkner's you've read all of his work deeply and recently? Which are his greatest books? What would you recommend that the rest of us not fail to read?
I think if you've not read Faulkner, or if you haven't read Faulkner lately, or if you've read Faulkner and you think he's too difficult or he doesn't speak to this time, I think the book to begin with is Light in August. That's the book, because you could begin with some simpler Faulkner. You could begin with some of the short stories. You mentioned A Rose for Emily, which is certainly a fine work of art. But Light in August, I think, is accessible. It gives you his what's dawning on him in terms of race, what race means in America. It has the whole lost cause theme in it with the Reverend Hightower. It pretty much encapsulates. It's a good representative Faulkner work, and it's a good one to get into. then I think you might very well read some of the short stories. You certainly want to read As I Lay Dying, Southern Poor Whites, and what it's like for them. The Sound and the Fury, I know, is difficult. People say it's difficult. I think once you know the story, once you realize in the first section it is told through the mind of an idiot, a 33-year-old man who's been essentially 3 years old for 30 years. Once you begin to see that, also one other thing I try to do in the biography with The Sound and the Fury, as different as Benji is, the idiot, Quentin, who's the Harvard student, Jason Compson, who is the materialist, the one who's bent on making money, who doesn't think he's a Compson, they're all the same in their ineptitude, so to speak. They're all Compsons. When you think about it, it doesn't matter who they are or what they do. They come to the same sort of futile result. So I think you have to get to the Sound of the Fury sooner or later. I think maybe through Light in August and As I Lay Dying. If you want to see the creation, Faulkner's discovery of Yaknapatawpha, his mythical county, then you read Flags in the Dust. It was originally published as Sartorus, but later the full manuscript was published, and that's where you get a very accessible view. The problem with Flags in the Dust is, in a sense, it's received wisdom. The treatment of, for instance, Black people in Flags in the Dust is not entirely stereotypical, but compared to later Faulkner, he hasn't yet transformed his material. So if you want to see the growth in Faulkner, you go from Flags in the Dust to The Sound and the Fury.
You know, you remind me that we haven't yet talked about race, and it's a subject that's on our minds. Faulkner had so many Black and mixed race characters in his books,
Yeah.
ranging from heroic characters like Dilsey and Clytie, Dilsey in The Sound and the Fury, and Clytie, who's the last woman standing in Absalom, Lucas Beauchamp, and the county is filled with characters who appear and appear again and appear at different ages and stages and contexts. How can these characters be viewed by us in contemporary terms? How did you come to see that body of characters?
I think by and large, even with the stereotypes and Flags in the Dust, but with the later work, you have to say, it seems to me, with the African American characters, and this was true in his life as well, he views them with a lot of affection and a lot of respect. At the same time, he knows that as a white man, there are certain things he can't understand. I think his best representation of how whites don't understand is the novel Go Down Moses, which I also included among his great works. If you want to really see his exploration of race and how whites, in his estimation, have failed to understand African Americans, that's certainly one of the books to go to for sure. I think I end my book with an African American's comment on Faulkner because the respect and the opinion of African Americans mattered to him, I think, very well. If you go outside the fiction, you're going to see in some of the interviews the unreconstructed Southerner. You're going to see some racist attitudes. You're going to see some condescension. It's kind of a shock to someone who reads the fiction. If there was never an argument that the better man is in the artist, the fiction, certainly Faulkner's work bears that out, I think. And I can't end without mentioning the book that I think is Faulkner's greatest, Absalom, in which he creates a mixed race character, Charles Bond, who is the most intelligent, most elegant, the most fascinating character maybe Faulkner ever created, that the white people are constantly having, in a sense, to catch up to try to understand, to fathom. So I think in terms of the race issue, you have to encounter Absalom. I think it's more difficult even than The Sound and the Fury. Faulkner's response always to someone who said, your work is difficult, he'd say, well, how many times have you read it? One student said to him at the University of Virginia 3 times, and Faulkner said, well, you better read it a 4th time.
And I bet you have, Carl.
Yes, I have.
So I think we'll see if people have questions
Sure.
in the audience here. Let's see. Carl, tell us about the subtitle of your first volume, The Past is Never Dead, It's Not Even Past. This phrase seems hauntingly tragic, even today.
Yeah, I'm glad someone asked that question, because I did write an essay about this recently for the Hedgehog Review, which you might look up. It's called Faulkner as Futurist, because I think that phrase, it's quoted all the time on my Google alerts for William Faulkner. Almost every day, someone quotes, the past is never dead, it's not even past. And they say Faulkner said, actually a character says it in Requiem for a Nun, because there's a sense in which Faulkner did not believe that. He had said in an interview he believed in Burke. It's one of the few times he admitted he had read a philosopher. He said, I believe in Bergson's theory of time, Henri Bergson, that all of time, in a sense, is present now. That what you do now, the actions that you take now, will change the past as much as the future. Sartre wrote a very interesting essay on The Sound of Fury, in which he does just the opposite. He says Faulkner's obsessed with the past, he can never get beyond it. I don't think that's true. I think that when you look at the totality of Faulkner's work, and he does often say this in his interviews, and I think it bears out, especially in the Snopes trilogy, life is motion. It's change. It's going to be different day by day. That's why Quentin finds things intolerable, because he's a prisoner of the past, both in The Sound of Fury and in Absalom Absalom. And his Canadian roommate in Absalom Absalom tries to tell him that your fealty to the South, your brooding over Southern history, is only part of the story. At one point, this Canadian shrew says, I who regard you now will have descended from the loins of African kings. Now, that line was written in 1936. That's a writer for the future.
I should tell people that Quentin Compson appears first in The Sound and the Fury and commits suicide during his first year at Harvard. And in Absalom Absalom, which is written how many years later? 10?
1936, about 5-6 years later.
6 years later. He appears again alive at Harvard, talking about a story that is the story of Absalom Absalom with his Canadian roommate Shreve. Let's see what other questions we have here. Indirection and opacity are such prominent features of Faulkner's fiction. Talk a bit about how difficulty and delusiveness emerge as literary values and their connection to it, and the connection between that and his life.
Well, I think one of the things that Faulkner does, you can pick a number of novels. Go Down Moses is a good example, or Absalom Absalom again is a good example. Faulkner is really wants you to not tell the story exactly, but to recreate the story. That if you look at Faulkner's narrators, they often act as though they don't know the whole story. And people who want a quick read, tell me what it is. Who did it? Who done it? Let's wrap up the story. And so there are these constant loose ends that people come back to again and again. This is true in the Snopes trilogy. It's true in Absalom Absalom. In a way, it's true in The Sound and the Fury. This retelling of stories that seem opaque or obfuscated or indirect, as the questioner says. And yet Faulkner, in a way, is saying, well, that was the best way to tell this story. There is no simple way out of this. We're going to come back to this theme again and again. We can't dispose of it.
Another viewer asks, how does a fable fit into the totality of Faulkner's work? The subject matter seems so different.
That's really interesting. In fact, I've just written a 10,000 word essay, which I've got to place somewhere. That is not what I say in the biography. In the biography, I'm more concerned about how his work in Hollywood shaped a fable. Fable is about World War One. It's about a regiment, regiment, which mutinies, and there's this armistice. There's this cessation of violence. And I think that a fable is a much misunderstood novel. People often see it as critical of the modern world, as the second coming of Christ, and he'll be crucified again. The Christ story is, as I read it now, having reread the novel recently, is not so important as it is essentially Faulkner saying, again, this is a writer for the future, what do we do now? What do we do with these massive modern institutions of government? And one of the interesting things is the way he treats mobs, public demonstrations. To me, in the novel, it's overturning in some ways some of the things he said earlier in his fiction. People resort to mobs when institutions fail, and to simply condemn mobs, to simply condemn violence, is to misunderstand that the society is breaking apart. That the problem is not the mob, the problem is the society. Now, that is a theme which occurs in a number of his other novels. Also, there's a long, and this goes back to his reading of Dickens and other 19th century novelists, including Thackeray and Sir Walter Scott. There's a kind of novel within the novel, which he did publish separately as Notes of a Horse Thief. And it's about a Negro hostler, this handler of horses, and two other characters who essentially thwart conventional society and run this three-legged horse in horse races around the world. It's tied up in a fable with this, again, in a way, celebration of individuality. Faulkner was very anti-New Deal, very anti-institution. And I think the fable in that way really fits into, you might almost say, the philosophy of Faulkner.
You know, I should announce that there's an Ask a Question line down at the bottom of your screens, and please feel free to ask a question if you'd like to. Another question that a audience member has is how Faulkner's homosexual preference influenced his delineation of the romantic lives of his characters. Did Faulkner have a homosexual preference or tendency, Carl?
Not that I'm aware of. There is actually a book called Gay Faulkner, and there's certainly gay characters in his fiction. Some of his early short stories deal very interestingly with homosexuality. He certainly, unlike some writers of his time, he was not anti-gay or anti-homosexual at all. So I think that certainly is part of his fiction. But I don't see anything personally. I never found any evidence of any kind of affairs with men. He did live with men in New Orleans, for example. He did know a lot. One of his best friends, Ben Wasson, was gay, but it didn't seem to be a sexual proclivity of his. But it's not a subject that he shied away from, or that he wanted in any sense to make fun of or to condemn.
Do you think his his intimacy with homosexual friends? He traveled in Europe with a homosexual painter,
Yes.
so he knew some gay men pretty well. Do you think that shows up in his work in any particular way?
Certainly in attitudes, in that he in spite of calling himself a Puritan, is not puritanical really about sex. Um, I think in that way it does, but I can't think of really gay characters per se, for example, or an interest in wanting to do that, either in his fiction or in his screen work. When I've taught Rose for Emily, there's a phrase in there about a character, Homer Barron, who's Miss Emily's lover, and he's called gay at one point, and my students say, "Ah." And I have to say, really, this is where a knowledge of history. I mean, first of all, the word was not even in currency in the 1930s, and Homer Barron is not presented, as far as I could see, in any homosexual way at all.
Another question, and it's a good one. Since we're coming to our close, did Faulkner in the end feel that he had achieved his artistic goals?
He did. In fact, he felt the last 2 or 3 novels that he was running dry. And some biographers leap on that. Oh, there's such a decline in his work. I don't think that's true. I think he wrote more deliberately. He said he wrote more slowly. He, starting with the Portable Faulkner, which came out in 1946, he felt that Malcolm Colley had kind of summarized his career in a way. But he wrote his last novel, that he wrote quickly in about 6 months, The Reivers, and it was only a month or so that he died after The Reivers was published. Who knows if he would have published more? The Reivers is a kind of nice coda to his career. It has passages which some sort of summarize Yak Napatof's history. He never doubted, almost from the beginning, even before he produced anything great, he never doubted that he was to become a great writer. I think he shares that with Norman Mailer, being a great mama's boy, and mama telling you right from the get-go, you're going to be something, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise.
Last question from me. So Fitzgerald, Roth, to some degree, Bellow, Shirley, aren't read now as they once were. Is Faulkner being read? Is Faulkner being taught in universities? Who is reading the works of William Faulkner now?
It's a mixed picture. Faulkner scholarship is very active. A lot of new work coming out all the time. And those scholars certainly are teaching Faulkner. On the other hand, I think in the general culture, he simply doesn't, but no writer has the kind of imprint that Faulkner had, for instance, in the 1950s, who would say, as he did, take a trip to Japan and just would be this revered figure. No writer can really approach that kind of reputation anymore. Faulkner, I think, is for the ages. I think right now, for instance, if you asked a New York publisher, as I did, to publish a biography of Faulkner, they would say not enough sales. There isn't enough interest in Faulkner. But he's always there. Norman Mailer said in one of his down periods, he said, "I'll always be back serving the meal." And I think that's where we are with Faulkner. So as I say, it's a mixed picture. I wouldn't want to say even that there's some kind of Faulkner renaissance. I don't know that there is, but I certainly hope my book and some books that are to come will lead people back to Faulkner, because he certainly isn't a relic. He's writing for us.
Well, your book certainly has led me back to Faulkner. I ended up reading The Reivers, which I have never read. And I'm looking forward to rereading some of the books that you analyze, take apart and put back together again so well. And for anyone who wants a terrific overview of the work of Faulkner and of his life in a very particular time in American history, a span of years, I can't recommend Carl's book highly enough. I think we're out of time. And I want to thank you, Carl. Thank the Levy Center and everybody who attended.
Thank you, Anne, and thanks everyone who was watching and listening.